On a stormy night in Vermont, Irene lived quietly inside her small wooden cabin. As the wind howled against the walls, she heard a faint, desperate whimper. When she opened the door, two tiny German shepherd puppies lay shivering on the porch, their breaths thin in the freezing air. She gathered them into her arms and carried them inside. In that moment, warmth returned, not only to the fragile pups, but to her heart as well. Yet Irene did not know this night was only the beginning of an extraordinary story. Watch now to discover what happened next. Snow fell in endless sheets over the mountains of Vermont. The wind carried it sideways, sweeping across ridges and valleys, burying fences and bending tall pines beneath the weight of ice. The world was painted in shades of white and gray, a landscape swallowed by silence except for the storm's restless howl. At the edge of a forest clearing stood a small wooden cabin. Its roof sagged under layers of snow smoke curling weakly from a chimney that struggled against the wind. The cabin looked fragile, as if it had been forgotten by time. Yet it held firm, bracing itself against another harsh winter. Inside lived Irene. Her hair had turned silver years ago, and her hands bore the marks of work and weather. Each wrinkle across her face told a story of time, of people she once loved, and of years she had endured alone. The cabin was her shelter, and her burden, both comforting and isolating in equal measure. Her days had grown quiet. She cooked simple meals, stacked wood near the fireplace, and watched the seasons move past her window. Sometimes she would sit by the fire with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the creaks of the wooden walls as if the house itself spoke to her. Other times, she would step onto the porch, the crunch of snow beneath her boots. The only sound that reminded her she was still part of the world beyond her memories. Loneliness had settled into her life, like the snow outside, soft yet heavy. The nearest town was miles away, and winter often cut her off for weeks. Letters no longer came. Visitors stopped arriving long ago. She had grown used to the silence, though at night it pressed harder, echoing in her chest. That evening the storm raged with unusual force. The wind scraped against the shutters, rattling them like impatient fists. The walls shuddered under its weight, and frost crept along the window edges. Irene stirred the fire until it blazed bright, hoping its warmth would fight off the chill that seeped into every corner. She settled into her chair shawl tight around her shoulders and let the flames paint her face with flickering light. The hours passed slowly. She closed her eyes, listening to the storm's rhythm. The groan of trees swaying in the distance and the steady crackle of wood in the hearth. Outside, the snow piled higher, swallowing paths and burying the porch steps. Irene had seen many storms in her life, but each one reminded her of the same truth: nature was vast and unrelenting, and she was only a small figure within it. Her thoughts wandered to the past. She remembered evenings when laughter had filled the cabin, when voices overlapped and the fire was surrounded by warmth greater than wood could give. Those days were gone, yet in the storm's lonely music, she could almost hear echoes of them. A sigh slipped from her lips, carried away by the hiss of the fire. Midnight crept closer. The storm showed no sign of rest. Irene shifted in her chair, listening to the walls hum with the wind's pressure. She thought of how tomorrow would look. Paths lost under snow trees bent low, her footsteps the only marks across the clearing. She tried to accept it, as she always had. Another long night, another winter evening survived. But just as she was ready to drift into half-sleep, the storm seemed to change its voice. Between the rush of wind came a sound that did not belong. It was faint, fragile, carried across the snow like a thread of breath. Irene opened her eyes, her body still. She tilted her head, straining to catch it again. There it was, a small sound almost lost beneath the storm. A whimper, delicate and desperate, reaching her door. Her heart stirred. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat upright, listening. The sound came again, a plea, hidden in the howl of winter. Irene hesitated, torn between fear and instinct. Then she rose from her chair, her steps slow across the wooden floor toward the door of her cabin. She reached out with trembling hands, ready to unfasten the latch. The metal latch felt icy against Irene's fingers. For a moment she froze, the storm's roar filling her ears, her chest rising and falling in short breaths. The sound outside came once more, a fragile cry that pierced the night. She swallowed hard, then pulled the latch free. The door groaned open, and the wind rushed in like a wild beast. Snowflakes swirled into the cabin, stinging her cheeks and blurring her sight. She blinked, leaning forward into the storm, and then she saw them. Two small figures huddled together on the wooden porch. Their bodies trembled, pressed against each other, as if clinging to life itself. The glow from the fire behind her touched their coats, revealing fur soaked with melting snow and crusted with ice. Tiny icicles clung to their whiskers, their ears drooped, and their wide eyes stared up at her with silent pleading. German shepherd puppies. Irene gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. For an instant, she wondered if her tired mind was playing tricks. But then one of them let out a weak whimper, struggling to stand, only to stumble back down. The other leaned closer, pressing its head against the porch boards as though surrendering to the cold. Her heart tightened. She stepped onto the porch, the wind battering her shawl. Kneeling despite the snow that soaked her skirt, she reached out with shaking hands. One puppy lifted its head, and the moment her palm touched its frozen fur, it leaned into her touch with a faint sigh, as though it had finally found shelter. The other tried to shift closer, but lacked the strength. Irene gathered them both gently, one against each arm. Their tiny bodies were stiff with cold, yet she could feel faint warmth still pulsing within. She held them tight against her chest, the chill of their fur biting through her clothes, her breath quick and uneven. "Come inside, little ones," she whispered, her voice breaking against the storm. "You are safe now." She rose slowly, her knees aching, and carried them across the threshold. With one last glance at the snow-choked porch, she shut the door firmly, sealing the storm outside. Inside, the sudden stillness rang in her ears. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the faint whimpers pressed against her chest. She looked down at the two fragile lives in her arms, and tears welled in her eyes. It had been years since she had held anything so small, so vulnerable, so desperately in need of care. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders as she hurried across the room. She laid them on a thick wool blanket near the fire, arranging their trembling bodies side by side. The flames cast a warm glow across their wet coats, and steam began to rise from the melting snow clinging to their fur. Their tiny noses twitched, and one gave a faint whine before closing its eyes, exhausted. Irene lowered herself to the floor, sitting close, her hands hovering as if afraid they might vanish if she looked away. For a long time, she simply watched, listening to their shallow breaths. The storm outside raged on, but here within her small cabin, two lives had crossed her path in the most unexpected way. She brushed a strand of silver hair from her face, her heart swelling with emotion she had not felt in years. Somewhere deep inside, something long dormant stirred awake. The puppies stirred faintly, their tails twitching weakly as the firelight wrapped around them. Irene leaned closer, whispering with quiet wonder, "You are safe." The night had delivered her a gift she could not yet understand. And as she pulled the blanket around their small frames, she did not realize that this single act of kindness would change everything by morning. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks into the chimney. Irene reached for the kettle that sat nearby, poured warm water into a shallow bowl, and set it beside the blanket. Her hands trembled as she searched the cupboard for scraps of food. She found a bit of bread soaked in milk, then cut small pieces of leftover meat from her supper. She placed the food close, and the scent stirred the puppies. Otis lifted his head first, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the air. Ollie followed with a faint whine, dragging himself forward on shaky paws. Irene's eyes filled with tears as she guided the pieces toward them. "Eat, little ones," she whispered. At first their movements were slow, clumsy, but hunger urged them on. They lapped at the milk, chewed the softened bread, and bit gently at the meat. Their tails twitched faintly, and with each bite color seemed to return to their faces. Irene pressed her hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the sight. For years her home had been silent, filled only with the sounds of creaking wood and the fire's crackle. Now there was life again. Soft whimpers, small paws scratching against the blanket, eager mouths working at the food she offered. She leaned closer, smiling through tears, feeling as if her heart itself was thawing in the fire's glow. When they finished, both pups curled together on the blanket. Their bellies round their eyes, heavy with drowsiness, they shifted closer to each other and sighed. Irene watched them, her mind drifting far back to a time when her cabin had been full of voices. She remembered laughter echoing across these walls, footsteps running on these floors, the warmth of family that once surrounded her. That warmth had faded with time, replaced by silence and the weight of loss. Yet here, lying just a few feet away, were two new sparks of life, fragile but determined, dependent yet already carrying something strong in their nature. Irene reached out and stroked their damp fur. It was coarse with cold and snow, but beneath she felt the rhythm of steady heartbeats. She lingered there, hand resting gently on both of them, unwilling to let go. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "You found me tonight, or perhaps I found you." The storm roared outside, but Irene barely noticed. Her cabin, so long a place of solitude, now pulsed with quiet energy. She sat with her back against the chair, the two pups curled before her, and a rare peace washed over her. She thought of tomorrow, of the endless snow waiting to be cleared, of the chores that would demand her aching hands. But for once, tomorrow did not feel like a burden. Tomorrow meant feeding these small creatures again. Tomorrow meant listening for their tiny steps on the wooden floor. Tomorrow meant life. The fire warmed her face and her eyes softened. She closed them for a moment, letting the sound of gentle breathing reach her ears. In the middle of a storm, she had been given company she never expected. Otis stirred suddenly, his ears twitching as he lifted his head. Ollie followed, blinking at the shadows that moved across the cabin. Irene frowned softly, her gaze moving from their alert eyes to the door. The pups did not move, but something in their watchful stillness unsettled her. It was only a flicker, a glimpse of something more. Irene leaned forward, brushing her hand across their fur to calm them. Their breathing steadied, and their heads lowered once again. But the thought lingered in her mind. There was something in their eyes, sharp and focused, as if they had been trained for more than survival. The fire burned low, casting a softer glow across the cabin. Irene shifted in her chair, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The two puppies lay curled on the blanket, their bodies pressed together, chests rising and falling in steady rhythm. For a while the room was quiet, a gentle contrast to the storm that battered the world outside. Yet every so often, Otis stirred. His head would lift, ears pricked, nose twitching at scents carried through the cracks in the wooden walls. Ollie mirrored him, blinking into the dim light, eyes sharp, as if searching for something beyond the cabin. Then, once satisfied, they settled again, tails brushing lightly against each other. Irene watched them, a crease forming on her brow. These were not the careless movements of stray pups. Even in their weariness, they carried themselves with a kind of discipline, a watchfulness that felt out of place for such young creatures. She leaned closer, studying the lines of their small bodies, the way their ears shifted at the slightest sound, the way their eyes followed shadows, as if reading them for meaning. The storm pressed on, rattling the shutters and shaking the windows. Irene flinched at a sudden gust, but the pups did not. Instead, they reacted only to subtle changes. A faint creak on the porch boards, the groan of a tree bent under snow, the whisper of something unseen in the distance. Their instincts were sharp, their senses tuned far beyond her own. When Irene reached out to stroke their fur, they leaned into her touch, but their gaze always drifted back to the door. It gave her the strange sense that they were guarding her, even in their small, fragile state. The thought sent a shiver through her, though not from the cold. She had lived many winters alone, yet tonight felt different. She was no longer the sole inhabitant of the cabin. She shared it with two beings who carried secrets in their eyes. After some time, the storm began to ease. The wind softened, though snow still fell heavy. Irene rose slowly, joints stiff, and crossed to the window. She wiped the frost with her sleeve and peered outside. The clearing was buried in white. The path to town vanished, the forest looming silent at the edge of the dark. She pressed her palm to the glass, listening, almost expecting to see movement out there. Behind her, Otis shifted again, ears pricked, while Ollie gave a low whine. Irene turned, heart quickening, but the cabin remained still. She told herself it was the storm playing tricks. Yet when she looked at the pups, she saw no fear in them, only alertness, as though they had been trained to measure every sound. She settled back onto the floor beside them, laying a hand gently over their small forms. The warmth of their bodies eased her nerves, even as their eyes glimmered with intelligence she could not ignore. They were more than helpless wanderers. She could sense it now. Something about them felt purposeful, as if fate itself had carried them to her door. The firelight flickered across her face, drawing lines of reflection in her eyes. She pulled the blanket higher over the pups, her thoughts drifting inward. Memories stirred uninvited, but insistent. Memories of what her home once held and of what she had lost. The fire burned low, its glow pulsing across the cabin walls like a heartbeat. Irene sat close to the warmth, her hand resting on the blanket that covered the two pups. Their soft breathing filled the room, steady and reassuring. Yet her own thoughts wandered far away. She looked around the cabin. The wooden table with its worn surface, the empty chairs tucked beneath it, the shelves lined with dishes that had not been touched in years. Once this place had been alive with sound. She remembered voices calling to one another, the crack of laughter rising above the clatter of pots, footsteps racing across the floor. She could almost hear it now, carried in echoes through the storm. Her gaze drifted to the framed photograph still resting on the mantel. She rose with effort, lifting it gently into her hands. In the faded picture, she and her husband stood side by side, a younger version of themselves, smiling proudly before the very cabin she stood in now. The children, two boys with bright eyes, clung to their parents' legs, full of life. Irene's throat tightened as she traced their faces with a trembling finger. They were gone. Her husband years before the boys, taken by time and distance. The silence that followed their absence had nearly broken her. For years she had woken to the same stillness, walked through rooms that no longer held laughter, and ended each night with only the wind as company. The cabin had become a shell filled with shadows of what once was. But tonight something had shifted. On the floor before her, Otis and Ollie stirred faintly in their sleep, small paws twitching as if they dreamed of running through fields. Their presence was fragile, fleeting. Yet it lit something within her chest that she had thought long extinguished. It was the spark of the weight of responsibility and the gift of companionship. She placed the photograph back on the mantel and returned to the pups. Lowering herself slowly, she let her hand rest over their tiny bodies, feeling their warmth seep into her skin. Tears welled not from grief this time, but from the strange comfort of knowing she was needed again. The fire whispered softly, filling the silence with a rhythm that matched her heart. She whispered into the stillness, almost afraid to give the words voice. "You have brought me back to life, little ones." The pups shifted closer to each other, as if hearing her. A faint smile touched her lips, and for the first time in many winters, Irene allowed herself to hope. The storm outside pressed against the cabin, but inside a different kind of flame glowed, one not born of wood and ash, but of memory and promise. The weight of loneliness lifted just enough for her to breathe freely. She leaned back against her chair, the firelight soft against her face. Her eyes grew heavy, lulled by the steady breaths of the puppies and the warmth that filled the room. As she drifted toward sleep, a sense of peace settled over her. Yet beneath it lay something unspoken, a tension she could not name. Her eyelids closed, her body sinking into rest. Then out of the quiet, Otis lifted his head, ears sharp. Ollie followed, his body tense, their eyes fixed on the door. Moments later, a bark split the silence, sudden and fierce, followed by a low growl that vibrated through the floor. Irene jolted awake, her heart pounding as the night outside held its breath. The cabin seemed to hold its breath with her. Irene pressed a hand to her chest, her pulse racing as the echoes of Otis's bark lingered. Ollie stood close beside him, shoulders stiff, his eyes locked on the heavy wooden door as though he could see through it. Their low growls rumbled in unison, steady and urgent, unlike the random cries of frightened pups. Irene rose slowly from her chair, her knees trembling more from fear than age. She peered toward the door, though the firelight behind her cast more shadows than answers. The storm outside had softened to a whisper, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the wind. Her gaze returned to the puppies. They had not moved from their post paws, planted firmly, bodies aligned. Irene's breath caught. They were not panicking. They were alert, focused, behaving with purpose far beyond their size. She whispered, "What do you sense out there?" Her voice was no louder than the crackle of the fire, yet the pups seemed to hear, their ears flicking toward her before snapping back to the door. The minutes stretched. Each creak of the cabin's timbers felt amplified, each gust of wind against the shutters like a warning. Irene's mind raced with possibilities, a wandering animal, a tree breaking under snow, or something more. The thought of a person standing out there in the dark pressed against her heart like ice. Unable to remain seated, she moved closer to the door. Her hand hovered over the latch, but the steady growl from Otis held her back. His eyes burned with warning, and Ollie nudged forward, his paws scraping the floor, ready to defend. Irene stepped back quickly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. The fire flared as a log split, startling her, yet the pups never wavered. Their attention did not shift for even a moment. The cabin was small, but in that instant, it felt vast, each corner echoing with the weight of the unknown. Irene drew in a slow breath, forcing her body to still. She whispered again, this time more to herself than them. "It is only the night, only the storm." Yet even as she said it, she felt the lie. The pups would not have reacted so fiercely to mere shadows. The hours dragged. She returned to her chair but could not close her eyes again. Otis and Ollie remained stationed near the door, occasionally pacing, their noses pressed to the gap beneath the wood, as if scenting what lay beyond. Sometimes they barked sharply, other times they only gave a low, vibrating sound that carried through her bones. The storm beyond the cabin grew distant, replaced by a silence that was far less comforting. Irene's ears strained against it, searching for a sign, any sign of what had unsettled them. She rubbed her arms, not from the cold, but from the unease that crawled beneath her skin. She thought of the photograph on the mantel of the faces she had lost. And for the first time in many years, she wished someone else were here beside her. Yet all she had was the fire, the storm, and 2 young German shepherds who refused to rest. At last, the faintest sound reached her. A shift in the snow outside, so soft she almost doubted it. But Otis stiffened at once, his head snapping toward the door. Ollie followed, barking in a burst that made Irene flinch. Her heart pounded as the noise came again, clearer this time. It was no animal rustling, no branch falling. It was deliberate, heavy, the sound of steps pressing into snow. Irene's breath caught her fingers digging into the armrest of her chair. The sound grew clearer with each passing second. A steady crunch, measured and heavy, as if someone moved with caution across the clearing. Irene's breath fogged the air, though she had not left her chair. The cabin no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a box closing in around her. Otis lunged toward the door, his paws striking the floor with sharp thuds. He barked fierce and demanding, his young body braced as though he were far older. Ollie rushed beside him, his voice joining in higher, but just as determined. The two pups planted themselves shoulder to shoulder, their barks echoing against the wooden walls. Irene's pulse quickened. She rose slowly, legs weak, and gripped the back of her chair for balance. The steps outside stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and unbearable. Then came another sound. A single footfall, deliberate and close, landing on the porch boards. The wood creaked, sending a shiver down her spine. Otis threw himself against the door claws, scraping his bark, erupting with a raw force that rattled the latch. Ollie mirrored him, body pressed forward, ears pinned and teeth flashing. They were not afraid. They were guarding her. "I am not alone," Irene whispered, though her voice trembled. Her eyes darted to the windows, their frosted panes glowing faintly with the fire's reflection. She wanted to move to shut the curtains tighter, but her feet felt rooted. The doorknob rattled. Just once. Quick testing. Irene gasped, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. Her heart thundered against her ribs. Otis barked so fiercely she thought his small chest might burst, while Ollie's growl rolled low, vibrating through the floorboards. The sound was unlike anything she had heard from a puppy before. Sharp, certain, full of defiance. The steps retreated, then slow and careful, circling away from the door. Irene strained to follow the sound. The crunch of boots pressed into snow again, moving along the side of the cabin. Her head turned with it, panic racing through her veins. She knew these walls, every groan of their beams, every weak spot. Someone walking the perimeter meant intent. It meant they were searching. She hurried to the mantel, her hand closing around the base of an old oil lamp. She lifted it, its weight both comfort and weapon, in her shaking grasp. The flame inside flickered wildly, casting shadows that stretched and bent along the walls. The puppies did not move from the door. Their bodies stayed low, their eyes burning with focus. Irene watched them and felt a rush of gratitude cut through her fear. Without them, she might never have known someone was out there, until it was too late. The footsteps grew faint, swallowed by the storm, but she could still sense the presence. The silence that followed was not peace. It was waiting. Watching. Irene's grip on the lamp tightened, her knuckles white. She stepped backward, closer to the firelight, her breaths uneven. For the first time in many years, she wished for another voice, another pair of hands in the cabin. But all she had was her courage, the storm, and the two young guardians who stood between her and the darkness outside. And as the wind shifted, she thought she saw movement at the edge of the frosted window. A shadow passing swift and close. Her heart clenched. The frost on the glass shivered as if something brushed against it from the outside. Irene's breath caught in her throat, the oil lamp trembling in her hand. The glow of its flame bent and twisted, throwing long shadows that danced across the walls. Then came the sound, slow, deliberate scraping along the wood of the cabin. It started near the window, a faint rasp like metal against frozen timber. Irene's heart lurched. Someone was testing the frame. Otis snapped first, his bark sharp and violent, cutting through the silence like a blade. Ollie joined him, his smaller voice high but insistent. Both pups lunged toward the window claws, clicking across the floorboards. Their bodies braced as if ready to strike through the glass itself. The scraping stopped, followed by another noise, the groan of a window pane straining against pressure. Irene's grip on the lamp tightened until her knuckles burned white. She lifted it higher, the flame trembling with her hand, and pressed herself against the far wall. She whispered to steady herself. "Stay strong, Irene. Stay strong." The pups snarled, low teeth flashing in the firelight. Their eyes glowed with a sharpness she had never seen in creatures so young. They planted themselves between her and the sound, their bodies small but unyielding. Another push came against the window. The frame rattled, frost flakes falling from the edges. Irene gasped, nearly dropping the lamp. She shuffled backward until her shoulders struck the edge of the mantel. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Whoever was out there paused, listening, measuring. Irene's chest rose and fell, in frantic rhythm, each breath too loud in the still cabin. The puppy's growls deepened, filling the air with a warning that carried weight far beyond their size. Then, sudden and sharp, the sound shifted. The intruder moved from the window to the back corner of the cabin. The boards groaned as a new attempt began, this time at a smaller window where the shutters had warped with age. The faint metallic squeal of a tool scraped against the latch. "Dear God," Irene whispered, clutching the lamp against her chest. She had no lock strong enough to resist if they forced it. The pups exploded again, rushing to the sound, their paws striking the wooden floor. They barked with such force that the old cabin seemed to vibrate. Irene flinched at their ferocity, but clung to it like a shield. Their cries carried through the storm, warning the night that this place was guarded. Outside, the scratching faltered. A heavy weight shifted against the wall, then pulled back. The snow crunched beneath boots, pacing, circling. Whoever it was had not left. They lingered, testing, searching for weakness. Irene pressed her back against the wall, the lamp clutched to her chest. Her breath shook with every exhale, but the sight of Otis and Ollie standing firm steadied her trembling. They were small, but they showed no hesitation. Their courage filled the space where hers faltered. The scraping stopped at last. Silence returned, thick and uneasy. The only sounds left were the growls still rumbling from the pups' throats, their eyes locked on the window ears, high and waiting. Irene dared a glance outside, though the frost blurred her view. A shadow slipped across the snow, swift and silent, before vanishing toward the trees. Her knees weakened, and she sank into her chair, clutching the lamp like a lifeline. She did not yet know if the danger had passed. But she understood one thing, with startling clarity. The intruder had been real. And these two young guardians had stood between her and whatever waited beyond. The fire cracked the sound, loud in the tense quiet. Otis barked again, sharp and final, as if to declare the night was not theirs to claim. The silence outside stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Irene held her breath, waiting, her ears straining against the storm's hush. Otis stood rigid before the door, barking again with a force that shook the small cabin. Ollie joined him, his sharper voice layering over his brother's, each cry demanding the night to step back. The sound was unrelenting. Their bodies shook with effort, their tails stiff, their paws braced against the wooden floor. They were young, yet in that moment, they carried the weight of seasoned guardians. Outside, the crunch of snow came once more. Heavy steps shuffled, uncertain, hesitating. The intruder lingered near the edge of the clearing, as if measuring the strength of what stood inside. Otis answered with another bark, fierce and defiant, his chest puffed, his teeth flashing in the glow of the firelight. Ollie's growl rolled low, a sound that did not belong to a fragile pup. The steps faltered. A pause, then another. Whoever it was, their resolve cracked beneath the sharp warning of the two dogs. The crunch of boots retreated at last, slow at first, then faster, as if pulled away by fear. Irene rushed to the frosted window, heart pounding, and caught a fleeting glimpse. A dark figure slipped between the trees, swallowed by the storm, until there was nothing left but white silence. Her knees gave way and she dropped into the chair, clutching the oil lamp with trembling hands. The flame flickered wildly, casting long shadows across the walls. For a long moment she could only stare at the door, listening to the echo of the retreating steps fade into memory. Then her gaze fell on Otis and Ollie. They remained at their post, staring at the door, ears high, chests rising fast from the strain of barking. Their eyes burned with determination, as if daring the intruder to return. Tears welled in Irene's eyes. A realization struck her heavy and undeniable. Without them, she might have been defenseless tonight. These two small lives had stood between her and danger. She whispered hoarsely, "You saved me." At her voice, both pups turned. Otis padded closer, resting his head against her knee, his breath still fast. Ollie followed, curling beside her feet, his tail tapping weakly against the floor. Their bodies trembled, but their eyes softened, the intensity giving way to the innocence of tired puppies once more. Irene lowered the lamp to the table and bent down, gathering them close. Their fur was warm now, their hearts thudding steady against her palms. She pressed her forehead to Otis's head, her voice breaking. "My brave boys." The storm outside carried on snow piling higher against the walls. But inside the cabin, Irene felt the strange, overwhelming safety of not being alone. Still, fear clung to her bones. The night had revealed that the wilderness beyond her walls was not empty. Someone had prowled close, testing her home, testing her resolve. Yet that danger had retreated because of two small guardians who refused to yield. Irene held them tighter, the firelight warming her tears. Gratitude filled her, fierce and aching, mixed with a truth she could not ignore. These pups were not ordinary wanderers. They had come to her for a reason. The cabin quieted once more, the storm's howl muffled by snow. Irene sank into her chair with Otis and Ollie pressed against her, her eyes too wide for sleep. She knew the night was far from over. The fire burned low, its glow soft and steady, painting the cabin in shades of amber. Irene sat with Otis and Ollie, tucked close against her legs, her shawl wrapped around the three of them like a fragile cocoon. She did not dare close her eyes. Each time her lids grew heavy, she saw again the shadow slipping past the frosted window, the outline of someone circling her cabin in the snow. The pups shifted restlessly, their ears twitching, their bodies still tense despite their exhaustion. From time to time, Otis lifted his head, sniffing the air as if measuring the night beyond the walls. Ollie would follow, pressing his nose toward the door, a low hum rising in his throat before fading. Then, just as quickly, they would nestle back against her, their warmth grounding her against the weight of fear. Irene stroked their fur with slow hands, her mind racing in circles. She thought of how easily the night could have ended differently. How the intruder might have forced the window, how the door might have given under pressure. She was only one frail woman in an old cabin. But then she looked down at the two puppies, their chests rising and falling in rhythm, and knew she had not been alone at all. "They guarded me," she whispered into the quiet, her voice catching. The words felt strange yet true. She had taken them in out of pity, believing them to be helpless. Yet tonight they had proven themselves more than that. They were protectors, silent and fierce, bound to her by something she could not yet name. Hours slipped by. The storm weakened outside, but the silence left behind was heavier than before. Irene sat upright, staring at the door, listening for every shift in the wood and every sigh of the wind. Her heart jumped at each small sound, yet the steady presence of Otis and Ollie kept her rooted. Their bodies leaned against her, their warmth flowing into her bones like medicine. She thought back to the photograph on the mantel, to her husband's strong hands and the children's eager eyes. Once she had felt secure in their laughter, in the simple act of sharing a home. That safety had vanished long ago, leaving her with only the ache of memory. But now in the glow of the dying fire, she felt something stir again. Not quite the same, but close enough to remind her she was alive. The pups stirred once more, ears pricked as if catching something in the distance. Irene held her breath, but no sound reached her. They stayed tense for a long moment, then lowered their heads again. She exhaled shakily, brushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead. The night stretched on, slow and endless. Her back ached from sitting too long, her eyes burned from strain, but she refused to give herself to sleep. Dawn would come eventually, she told herself. And when it did, perhaps the storm would lift the veil from the world and show her what still lingered out there. Otis and Ollie pressed closer, sighing into the folds of her shawl. She kissed the top of their heads, tears glistening in her eyes. "You are my silent guardians," she whispered. The fire dimmed to embers, and a faint gray light began to creep through the frosted windows. Irene leaned forward, her heart tightening as she realized the night had passed without the intruder's return. Relief mingled with dread, because silence did not always mean safety. Then faint at first, but rising fast, a new sound cut through the stillness. A sharp wail, distant yet growing, carried by the wind. The howl of sirens. Irene straightened, her body rigid. Red and blue light flickered across the trees outside, washing the snow in strange shifting colors. The crunch of heavy tires and the slam of doors followed. The clearing filled with movement. She clutched the pups to her chest, fear rising once more. The night had not ended. It was only changing shape. The sirens tore apart the morning silence, their wails bouncing through the forest and scattering across the frozen hills. Irene pressed her back against the chair, clutching Otis and Ollie tight against her chest. Their bodies tensed, ears flicking, eyes darting to the door as red and blue light pulsed through the frosted windows. Engines rumbled, tires crunched deep into the snow, and then came the sharp slam of doors. Voices carried through the clearing, short, urgent calls muffled by the storm. Irene rose slowly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her hands trembling as she set the pups down on the blanket. They remained alert, noses pressed to the airtails, stiff with uncertainty. She moved to the window, wiping away frost with her sleeve. What she saw made her heart lurch. At least half a dozen police cars lined the edge of the clearing, their lights flashing in rhythm, washing the snow in harsh shades of crimson and blue. Officers moved quickly between vehicles, their dark uniforms stark against the white drifts. Some scanned the tree line with flashlights, beams of light cutting through the branches. Others adjusted radios on their shoulders, speaking into them with clipped tones. Irene's pulse quickened. She had lived many winters in solitude, far from the rush of town life, and she had never seen this much authority gather outside her cabin. For an instant, she wondered if they had come for her, if somehow she had done wrong simply by surviving. Otis barked, suddenly sharp and low, as if answering the chaos outside. Ollie joined in, his smaller body vibrating with tension. Their cries filled the cabin, echoing against the wooden walls, until Irene knelt beside them and laid her hands on their backs. "Quiet, little ones," she whispered, though her voice shook. "We must see what this is." The morning light spread thin across the clearing gray sky, bleeding into the storm's edge. The red strobes reflected against the snow, staining it like fire across ice. Irene pressed her forehead to the window pane, her breath fogging the glass. One officer moved closer to the cabin, his boots sinking with each step. He gestured to others, pointing at the porch. Irene's stomach tightened. She pulled back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The memory of the intruder returned, the shadow scraping against the window, the steps circling her home. Could it be that the same presence had drawn the police here? Or had Otis and Ollie been connected to something larger? Something she could not yet understand? Her fingers found the edge of the mantel for balance. The photograph still rested there, her family frozen in time, their smiles soft against the faded paper. She thought of them now, of how they might have steadied her, in this moment of how alone she truly was. The clearing outside filled with movement again. More voices, more beams of light striking the cabin walls. The sound of boots approached the porch, deliberate and heavy. Irene clutched the pups close, their small bodies pressed tight against her legs. Otis let out another bark, deeper than before, as if to announce they were ready. Ollie lowered his head, teeth flashing for an instant in the firelight. Then came the sound she had dreaded, sharp and close. Knuckles rapping firmly against the cabin door. The wood rattled with the force. "Irene," she whispered to herself, "you must hold steady." The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a voice outside, firm and commanding. "Ma'am, this is the police. Please open the door." Her breath froze in her chest. She looked down at the pups, their eyes gleaming with the same fierce energy she had seen in the night. They were not afraid. They were waiting. Irene reached out her hand, hovering over the latch. Irene's hand trembled over the latch. The pups stood pressed to her legs, their bodies' tense ears pricked forward. Another sharp knock rattled the door, followed by the same steady voice. "Ma'am, we are the police. Please open the door." Her chest rose and fell as if the air itself had grown heavy. With a slow breath, she slid the latch free. The door groaned as it opened against the storm's weight. A flood of light and movement filled the threshold. Officers stood on her porch, snow clinging to their dark uniforms, their radios crackling with static. The flashing beams from the patrol cars washed over their faces, painting them red, then blue, then pale again. At the front was a tall man with sharp eyes, softened by exhaustion. His breath came in clouds as he removed a glove and held one hand out, palm open in peace. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I am Captain Nicholas. We've been searching through the night." Irene's grip tightened on the doorframe. Behind her, Otis and Ollie barked in unison, their small bodies firm against the floorboards. The officer's eyes darted past Irene, then widened. Relief flickered across their faces. There one of them whispered, "We found them." Captain Nicholas exhaled, his shoulders lowering, as though a great weight had been lifted. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the porch. His eyes lingered on the two pups by the fire, their coats still rough with melted snow, their tails rigid with unease. "Otis, Ollie." His voice softened, almost breaking on their names. At the sound, both pups froze. Their ears tilted, and for a heartbeat the wild tension in their eyes shifted into something else, recognition. Irene's heart skipped. She looked from Nicholas to the pups, then back again, her confusion thickening. The cabin filled quickly with the presence of uniformed men. They brushed snow from their coats, their radios murmuring with distant voices. Yet even in their urgency, their gazes carried awe, as if the sight of the two small German shepherds alive and well meant more than any words could express. Otis padded forward first, his tail lowering, his head tilted as he sniffed at Nicholas's outstretched hand. Ollie followed slower, cautious, his paws pressing into the rug. Nicholas knelt on one knee, the weight of command melting into the tenderness of reunion. He let the pups brush their noses against his palm, his eyes glistening with unspoken relief. "You two," he murmured, voice low, so only they could hear you, held on. The other officers crowded closer, some kneeling, some resting their hands on their knees, each touched by the sight. One man wiped his face with a gloved hand, shaking his head as though he could hardly believe it. Irene watched in silence, her lamp still clutched in her hands. Her fear had not left her, but in its place grew a deeper question. She had thought Otis and Ollie were fragile wanderers, lost in the storm, yet here they were greeted by these men, as if they were family long separated. Captain Nicholas rose, turning to her. His voice was calm now, respectful. "Ma'am, you saved them," he said. "You may not yet understand, but you've done more than you realize." Irene's throat tightened. She glanced down at the pups, their bodies pressed close to her, once again, unwilling to leave her side, even as their eyes lingered on Nicholas. She bent and touched their heads, her shawl falling around them like a shelter. The storm outside had quieted, the clearing filled with the glow of flashing lights. Yet inside, the questions pressed closer than the night ever had. What were these puppies to these men? What story was hidden in their eyes? Captain Nicholas stepped nearer, his expression steady, his next words carrying weight that promised to change everything. Irene believed. Captain Nicholas stood near the hearth, his tall frame outlined by the fading firelight. His voice carried a weight that settled over the cabin, soft yet commanding. "Ma'am," he began, his eyes shifting from Irene to the two pups pressed at her feet. "These little ones are not strays. They are part of our canine training program." Irene blinked, her lips parting, though no words came. She looked down at Otis and Ollie, who leaned against her legs, their eyes bright and alert, their ears turning with every sound outside. The words barely fit the image before her. To her, they were simply two fragile creatures she had carried in from the storm. Nicholas continued, his tone steady, but laced with relief. "Yesterday, during a field operation, our unit was tracking a dangerous suspect. The storm swept in worse than any forecast predicted. Otis and Ollie were separated from the team during the search. We've been out all night combing the forest, fearing the worst." At his words, Irene felt her stomach tighten. The shadow, the scraping at the window, the deliberate footsteps on the porch. It all came rushing back. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The intruder," she whispered. "That man." Nicholas nodded gravely. "The suspect we were pursuing is wanted for violent crimes. He used the storm to cover his tracks. Our reports put him near these woods. What you experienced last night wasn't imagination. He was here circling your home." Her knees weakened, and she steadied herself against the chair. Her mind replayed the growls, the barks, the way the pups had stood guard without hesitation. She had thought it instinct. Now she saw it for what it was: training. "They sensed him," Nicholas said, his gaze falling on the pups with quiet pride. Even so young, their instincts held. "They warned you. They stood between you and harm. That is what they were born to do." Irene bent slowly, her trembling hands brushing across their fur. Otis pressed closer, while Ollie raised his head and licked her fingers. Tears pricked her eyes. "They saved me," she said softly. Nicholas inclined his head. "Yes, and you saved them. Without your shelter, they would not have survived the cold. By morning, we might have been too late." The cabin fell into silence, except for the soft crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of officers outside. Irene's heart ached as she looked between Nicholas and the two pups. What she had thought of as chance was now revealed as something larger, a chain of events that bound her to them in ways she could not explain. She lowered herself into her chair, Otis and Ollie at her feet. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "They are not mine, then." "They belong to this work," Nicholas answered gently, "to the service ahead of them." But his voice softened. "What you gave them tonight can't be replaced. You will always be part of their story." The words settled heavy in her chest. She looked down again. The pups pressed close, their warmth anchoring her in the swirl of fear and gratitude. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to bolt the door to keep them safe inside her cabin forever. Yet as she gazed into their intelligent eyes, she knew they carried a destiny greater than her arms could hold. Otis lifted his head, ears pricked once more. Ollie followed their gaze, drawn to the door. The officers outside shifted their footsteps, crunching in the snow, waiting for Nicholas's signal. The captain turned to Irene, his voice firm, yet kind. "May we come in? There is more to tell, and you deserve to hear it." Irene swallowed hard. The pups pressed against her legs, standing tall before her, their bodies angled protectively, as if to shield her from the men who had come. She rose slowly, her heart caught between fear and trust, and stepped back from the door. The door creaked wider, letting in the sting of winter air, and the sound of boots crunching on the porch. One by one, the officers stepped inside, their heavy coats dusted white, their breath forming pale clouds in the dim light. The scent of cold and iron filled the room as the fire snapped against the silence. Irene stood back, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Otis and Ollie moved in front of her, their small frames tense tails, stiff, their eyes never leaving the men. Their bodies formed a barrier, one paw slightly ahead of the other, their teeth bared in flashes of warning. The officers paused, exchanging looks. Some crouched low, careful not to startle the pups further. The cabin seemed to shrink, the weight of their presence pressing against the old wooden walls. Captain Nicholas stepped forward, his voice calm, even as if speaking to a friend. "Easy now, Irene. And you boys, easy." He lowered himself to one knee, his eyes level with the pups. His tone shifted to warmth, a softness that cut through the air. "Otis, Ollie, you did well." At the sound of their names, the pups wavered. Otis's growl thinned into a whine, his ears twitching uncertain. Ollie held his stance longer, teeth still flashing, until Nicholas extended his gloved hand, palm open, steady and sure. "They are protectors," Nicholas said, his gaze lifting to Irene even in their youth. "That instinct you saw tonight is what makes them invaluable to us." Irene's chest tightened. She knelt slowly behind them, placing her hand on their backs. "They think they must guard me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Nicholas nodded, his expression both proud and sorrowful. "That is their nature. They bond, they defend, and they give all they have, but it is also what makes them vital to our work. They are part of something larger, Irene, a unit trained to protect lives, to track, to rescue. They were born for this." The firelight flickered, painting Nicholas's face with shifting shadows. He spoke with the quiet conviction of a man who had seen what these dogs could become. "Someday when they are grown, they will save people you may never meet. They will go into danger without hesitation. And the strength you gave them tonight, the shelter, the food, the warmth, will be carried with them always." Otis took a cautious step forward, pressing his nose toward Nicholas's hand. Ollie followed a moment later, his growl dissolving into a soft whimper. The officers exhaled, the tension in the cabin easing as the pups began to accept the presence of the men. Still, they circled back to Irene, brushing against her legs, pressing close as though reminding her they belonged to her for now. She stroked their fur with trembling fingers, torn between pride and a sorrow she could not yet name. Nicholas rose to his feet, his tone gentler now. "You gave them a night they might not have survived without. You gave them safety when the storm and worse, could have taken them. That will always matter." Irene's eyes glistened as she nodded faintly. The pups looked up at her, their gaze steady, their bodies leaning into her touch. Around them, the officers stood in silence, their faces softened by the sight of the fragile woman and the two loyal creatures who would not leave her side. The cabin glowed with firelight, a fragile peace suspended in the air. Yet beneath it lingered the truth, that soon decisions would need to be made, and the bond forming in this room would be tested. Otis nudged her hand, Ollie pressed his head against her knee, their eyes locking onto hers with an unspoken plea. The cabin seemed smaller with so many men inside, yet Irene noticed none of them. Her attention was fixed on the two pups pressed against her legs, their eyes wide and pleading, their warm bodies trembling with fatigue, yet unwilling to move away. Otis placed his paw on her knee as if anchoring himself to her. Ollie curled tighter against her side, his nose buried in the folds of her shawl. Each time an officer stepped forward, both pups shifted, placing themselves between Irene and the strangers, as though declaring her their center. The men stood silent, moved by the display. Their uniforms bore the weight of command, but in their eyes lingered something gentler. Recognition, even admiration. One officer rubbed the back of his neck, his voice low. "They don't want to leave her." Nicholas said nothing at first. He watched quietly, his jaw set, his gaze softened by something personal. Then he took a careful step forward, crouching slightly so his eyes were level with the pups. "It's all right," he said, voice calm. "You're safe. She kept you safe." Otis looked at him, ears twitching, then turned back to Irene, his body leaning closer against her. Ollie gave a soft whimper, as if voicing the same plea, that they belonged here with her. Irene stroked their fur, her hand trembling. She felt the pull of their hearts in every touch, the desperate weight of lives that had chosen her as their shelter. Tears welled in her eyes, though she blinked them back. She had thought herself too old for this kind of bond, too worn by loneliness to invite such ties again. Yet here they were, refusing to let go. The officers exchanged glances. Some smiled faintly, others bowed their heads as though humbled by the strength of what they witnessed. For them, these were future canines, dogs in training who would one day serve with valor. But at this moment, they were simply two young lives, clinging to the woman who had given them warmth in the storm. Nicholas cleared his throat, but his voice was unsteady when he spoke. It is rare, he admitted, to see them bond so deeply so quickly. They must have sensed something in her, something they needed. Irene looked up, startled by his words. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She lowered her gaze again, her hand brushing over Otis's head. Ollie's back. "They need me," she whispered. "And you need them," Nicholas replied softly. Silence settled, broken only by the steady crackle of the fire. The light painted the pups in gold, their eyes reflecting both innocence and loyalty. Irene's heart swelled painfully as she realized the truth in Nicholas's words. One officer shifted his weight, his voice hushed with awe. "They've chosen her." The statement hung in the air, heavy yet undeniable. The pups clung tighter, their eyes searching Irene's face, their bodies refusing to part. Irene held them close, her tears falling freely now. She pressed her cheek to the top of Ollie's head, her arms encircling them both. In that embrace, the cabin no longer felt cold, no longer lonely. It pulsed with life, with connection, with the silent vow of two guardians who would not abandon her. The men looked on, their expressions softened, touched by something beyond duty. For a moment they were not officers or handlers. They were simply witnesses to a bond born of survival, etched deep in the storm's shadow. Irene lifted her head, her eyes meeting Nicholas's across the room. Her voice was quiet but steady. "They are still mine for now." Nicholas gave a solemn nod. "For now, yes." The firelight danced across the cabin walls, each flicker pulling Irene deeper into memory. Her arms still cradled Otis and Ollie, their warmth pressed against her chest, and in their breathing she heard echoes of another time. She closed her eyes, letting the storm's howl fade into the distance. What rose instead were the faces of the past. Her husband chopping wood outside this very cabin, her children laughing as they tracked snow across the floor, her own voice rising above theirs in playful scolding. The cabin had once been alive with sound, with joy. Now for years it had been a shell carrying only the weight of silence. That silence had been heavy, almost unbearable. There had been nights when she sat by the fire and wondered what purpose remained for her. Nights when the creak of the walls was her only company. Nights when she had felt invisible to the world. And then, last night, the storm had raged, and she had opened the door to two fragile creatures nearly frozen in the snow. She remembered their trembling bodies, the way Otis had leaned into her hand, the way Ollie had collapsed into her arms. She had thought she was rescuing them. But in truth, the moment they pressed against her chest, she had felt something shift inside her, something that had been sleeping for too long. Looking down at them now, curled against her, as if she were the only safe place, they knew Irene felt the truth settle like a stone in her heart. They had pulled her back from the abyss. They had given her a reason to rise from her chair, to fight the fear of the night, to face the storm with courage. Her hands smoothed over their fur soft now in the glow of warmth and care. "My little ones," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You brought me back." Otis shifted his paw, pressing against her arm, his dark eyes lifting to meet hers. Ollie sighed, his head nestling deeper into the folds of her shawl. Their bond was silent, but it rang louder than any words. The officers in the cabin kept still, their eyes fixed on the woman and the pups. They saw the way her frail body straightened as she held them, the way her tears fell not from sorrow, but from renewal. It was clear to them that this was more than shelter. It was salvation. Nicholas stepped closer, but he did not speak. He seemed to understand that this moment belonged to Irene, to the fragile warmth she had thought lost forever. His men shifted quietly, their boots scraping against the floor as they lowered their gazes, each one giving her the dignity of silence. The fire popped, scattering sparks into the chimney. Irene rocked slightly as though soothing the pups into deeper sleep, though they were already still trusting her completely. For the first time in years, she felt what it was to be needed, not as a memory, but as a living truth pressing against her hands. The storm outside no longer felt like a threat. It was distant, powerless against the glow of life inside her cabin. She leaned her cheek against Otis's head, her eyes closing, a faint smile trembling across her lips. "Yes," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I thought I had saved them, but they saved me too." The weight of the night seemed to ease her body, lightened by gratitude, her spirit steadied by the bond at her feet. Nicholas stood at last, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor, his breath slow and heavy. The firelight carved sharp lines into his face, softening only when his gaze settled on Irene and the two pups curled at her feet. For a moment, he simply looked at them, as though gathering the weight of the scene before him. Then he spoke. His voice was low but steady, carrying a depth that pulled every eye in the room. "If it weren't for you, ma'am," he said solemnly, "they would not have survived the night." The words struck the cabin like a bell. Irene looked up, her eyes glistening. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. The truth of his statement filled the air, undeniable and sharp. Around her, the officers bowed their heads, their shoulders shifting with quiet reverence. They had searched through the dark for these two small lives, and here they were, saved not by their training or strength, but by the compassion of a woman, forgotten by the world. Irene lowered her gaze to Otis and Ollie. Their bodies pressed against her, their tiny hearts beating steady under her hand. Her lips trembled as she found her voice. "They saved me too," she whispered. The room fell into silence. No boots scraped against the floor, no radio crackled. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as though listening. Nicholas's eyes softened, the hard lines of command giving way to something deeply human. He nodded once firmly, but his voice when he answered was hushed. Then perhaps that was always their purpose. The officers shifted uneasily, some swallowing hard, others blinking against the sting in their eyes. One man turned slightly away, rubbing his jaw as though to hide the emotion that broke across his face. Irene sat taller, though her frail frame looked fragile against the glow of the fire. Her hand stroked the pups slowly, her eyes far away, yet filled with light. "I had thought my days of mattering were behind me," she said quietly. "But last night, for the first time in years, I was needed again." No one moved. The truth of her words pressed into every heart in the room. The pups shifted closer, their tails brushing faintly against her shawl as if sealing her statement with their presence. Nicholas stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floor. He removed his cap, holding it in his hands as he bowed his head briefly toward her. When he lifted his eyes again, they glistened in the flicker of the flames. "On behalf of all of us," he said, his voice thick with gratitude, "thank you." The words hung in the cabin, simple yet powerful. Irene lowered her head, her lips curving into a faint, fragile smile. She had been alone for so long, yet in this moment she was surrounded by men who understood the bond of loyalty, by two pups who had chosen her, and by the glow of a fire that seemed brighter than it had in years. Otis shifted, placing his paw once more on her knee, his gaze steady as though he too spoke his thanks. Ollie licked her hand gently, his tail tapping the rug. Irene let out a shaky breath, her tears slipping freely now. The fire crackled, breaking the silence, but no one spoke. Words were unnecessary. What had been shared in that moment was deeper than speech, carried in the eyes of every soul present. Yet the world outside was waiting. Duty pressed against the walls of the cabin, reminding them all that time was short and choices could not be delayed. Otis and Ollie lifted their heads together, their eyes turning toward the door as if sensing what was to come. Irene's heart sank, her hands clutching their fur tighter. She knew this peace would not last. It was then that Nicholas drew a slow breath, his voice low but filled with reverence. Nicholas stood with quiet resolve, the weight of decision etched across his face. He gave a single nod, and the officers moved gently toward the pups. Their boots creaked against the wood, their voices hushed, as though even they feared breaking the fragile bond that filled the cabin. Irene clutched Otis and Ollie tighter, her arms trembling. "Must it be now?" she asked, her voice breaking more plea than question. Nicholas's gaze softened, but his reply carried the firmness of duty. "The storm has cleared enough for us to move. We need to bring them back." The pups seemed to understand. Otis pressed his head against Irene's chest, his small body shuddering as if sensing the parting. Ollie whined, pawing at her shawl, refusing to release her. Irene bent low, wrapping both arms around them, her cheek pressed to their fur. Tears slid freely down her wrinkled face, falling onto their coats, warm drops against cold fur. "You came to me when I thought I had no one," she whispered, her words muffled by their bodies. "And now you leave me, but you will always be mine in here." She tapped her chest, her tears soaking into their fur. The officers waited silent, their own eyes damp. None urged her to hurry. They knew some moments should never be rushed. At last Irene loosened her hold, though her fingers lingered. Nicholas knelt beside her, his large hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You've given them more than shelter," he said softly. "You gave them strength to face the world." Irene looked at him through blurred vision, then nodded faintly. She kissed the top of Ollie's head, then Otis's, her lips trembling. "Be brave," she whispered to them both. "The world needs you." Two officers stepped forward, gently coaxing the pups toward the door. Otis resisted at first, his paws pressing into the rug, his eyes locked on Irene. Ollie whined, pulling against the guiding hands. Their reluctance pierced her heart. Each glance, they gave her a knife, twisting deeper. Snow swept in through the open door, cold wind whistling as the world outside called them back. Irene rose unsteadily, following them to the threshold. Her shawl whipped around her in the draft, her tears stinging in the bitter air. Otis turned once more, his ears back, his eyes pleading. Ollie too looked over his shoulder, his tail wagging faintly, though his paws dragged. Irene bent low, gathering them one last time into her arms. The wind howled, carrying her sob into the clearing. She pressed her face into their fur, breathing them in, knowing this was the last time she would hold them as her own. "Go," she whispered through tears. "But remember me." Nicholas gave the signal, and slowly, gently, the officers guided the pups away. Their small bodies moved into the snow, dwarfed by the men who walked beside them. Yet even as they were led across the clearing, they turned again and again, their eyes never leaving Irene. She stood in the doorway, her hands pressed to her chest, watching until their shapes blurred with the storm. The cold wind bit into her skin, but she did not move. Only when the last trace of their dark coats disappeared into the swirl of red and blue lights did she close her eyes, her tears mingling with the sting of the winter air. The cabin behind her was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. Their presence lingered a warmth that even the storm could not erase. The flashing lights of the patrol cars cut through the swirling snow, fading as the convoy prepared to leave the clearing. Irene lingered at the doorway, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes burning with the memory of Otis and Ollie's small bodies pressed against hers. The storm's howl filled the silence they had left behind, a silence that clawed at her chest. She turned slowly, ready to retreat into the cabin, when a firm hand touched her shoulder. Startled, she looked up. Captain Nicholas stood beside her. His tall frame bent slightly against the wind, his face lined with both exhaustion and compassion. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, but carrying the steady tone of a vow. "I need you to know this. Tonight you became part of something bigger than you realize." Irene's lips trembled, though no words came. Her throat ached with the weight of unshed tears. Nicholas glanced toward the path where the pups had been led, then back to her, his eyes steady. "Otis and Ollie are not just trainees. They're the future of our K-9 unit. Their instincts, their courage. It was all tested here in this cabin. But what you gave them, the warmth, the strength, the bond, you became their anchor. That can't be undone." Her heart clenched. She wanted to protest, to beg for them back, to claim them as her own. Yet the conviction in his voice told her she could not. They were destined for a different path, one marked by duty. Nicholas continued, his tone gentler now. "When their training is complete, when they stand tall as full partners to our officers, you will see them again. I promise you that. Because their story cannot be told without you." The words pierced through her grief like light through storm clouds. Irene lifted her eyes, searching his face for any sign of false comfort. But his expression was steady, sincere, carved with the weight of truth. Her voice quavered when she finally spoke. "You promise?" Nicholas placed a hand over his chest. "On my honor. You are part of their beginning, and when the time is right, you will be part of their triumph." Tears spilled freely down Irene's cheeks. She pressed a hand to her heart, her breath trembling in the cold air. "Then I will wait," she whispered. "However long it takes." Nicholas gave a solemn nod, his eyes softening. He lingered for a moment longer, as if reluctant to leave her alone before stepping back toward his men. The snow crunched beneath his boots. His figure swallowed slowly by the flashing lights. Irene watched him go, her heart heavy, yet held aloft by the promise he had left her. She turned back into the cabin, the fire dim, but still glowing. She sat in her chair, her hands pressed against the blanket where the pups had lain. The warmth was gone, but the memory lingered, seared into her skin. Outside, the engines roared, and the convoy began to pull away. Irene closed her eyes, letting the sound fade, clutching Nicholas's words like a lifeline. She whispered into the quiet, "I will see you again, my brave ones." And though the storm still pressed against the walls, Irene felt the faint stirring of peace. For in the promise of reunion, she had found something she thought lost forever: hope. The rumble of engines faded into the distance, swallowed by the trees and the blanket of snow. Irene stood on the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her thin shoulders, the cold wind tugging at its edges. She did not move, her eyes fixed on the faint glow of taillights until even that slipped beyond sight. The storm had weakened, leaving the world wrapped in silence. Snow still fell, but gently now, drifting like feathers onto the clearing. The forest, once a wall of menace, glistened beneath the pale light of dawn. For the first time in many years, Irene saw the beauty in its stillness. Her chest ached with absence, yet pride swelled within her like a quiet flame. She pictured Otis and Ollie walking beside the men, their small paws pressed into the snow, their heads lifting against the wind. They were leaving her, yes, but not into loss. They were walking toward purpose, carrying with them the warmth she had given. She pressed her hand to her heart, whispering into the cold air, "Go well, my brave ones. Carry me with you." The morning light broke through the storm clouds, streaks of gold piercing the gray. It touched the cabin walls, the snowdrifts piled high, the frozen branches bending under the weight of winter. The harsh night had passed. What remained was calm, and in that calm, Irene felt something she had not known in years: belonging. She thought back to the moment she had opened the door, the sight of two fragile lives shivering in the snow. She had believed she was saving them. But as the hours had unfolded, she had come to see the truth. They had saved her from the deep well of loneliness, from the silence that had weighed her down for so long. The officer's words echoed in her mind. They've chosen her. And in a way, she had chosen them too. The bond was not broken by distance. It would live in her heart until the day promised by Nicholas arrived. She stepped down from the porch, her boots sinking into the soft crust of snow. The clearing stretched wide before her, now empty of cars and men, but filled with traces of their passage. Boot prints, tire marks, the paw prints of the two who had changed everything. She bent low, pressing her fingers gently into one of the small prints, her tears falling fresh onto the snow. A smile curved through the grief. "You are part of me now," she said. Rising, she looked toward the horizon. The sky blazed with a faint red glow, the storm clouds breaking apart to reveal the promise of a brighter day. Irene straightened her frail shoulders, her breath rising in soft clouds. She felt older and younger all at once, burdened by loss, yet lifted by the gift of love she had been given. The cabin behind her no longer seemed like a place of emptiness. It was a place where life had returned, where kindness had planted seeds that would grow beyond its walls. Irene turned, stepping back onto the porch, her shawl trailing against the wood. She cast one final glance at the forest where the convoy had vanished, her eyes glistening not with despair, but with quiet determination. From a single night in a blizzard, she had found more than she thought possible, the reminder that kindness could ripple outward, saving not only those in need, but the giver as well. As the dawn painted the sky in shades of fire and light, Irene whispered to the wind, her voice steady, filled with hope. "This is not the end. It is the beginning." And with that, she stepped back inside the cabin, no longer silent but alive, with the memory of two small lives that had rekindled her own. From a night of storm and fear, Irene discovered more than survival. She discovered the healing power of compassion. By opening her door to two fragile German Shepherd puppies, she reminded us all that kindness, even the smallest act, can ripple into something far greater than we imagine. Otis and Ollie came to her as shivering strays, but they revealed themselves as more than that. They were protectors in the making, future guardians who would one day stand beside officers, serving and saving lives. Yet before any of that, they were simply two vulnerable souls in need of warmth. And Irene, with her gentle hands and open heart, gave it freely. This story is a reminder of the deep bond between humans and dogs, especially the German Shepherd, a breed known for loyalty, courage, and devotion. They do not ask for riches or recognition. They ask only for care. and in return, they give their all. In the darkest hours, their presence can light a fire strong enough to push back loneliness, fear, and despair. Irene's cabin, once silent with years of solitude, became a place of life and meaning again. In helping the puppies survive, she herself was pulled back from the cold edges of isolation. Their exchange was simple, yet profound. She gave them warmth, and they gave her purpose. As readers, we are left with a truth worth carrying into our own lives. Acts of kindness matter. Compassion bridges the gaps between strangers. And in every choice to protect nurture and love, we create a world where both people and animals can flourish together. May Irene's story and the steadfast gaze of Otis and Ollie remind us always that love is never wasted and hope is never lost.